Welcome to our award-winning show, Opera Out of the Box, unpacking opera piece by piece. I'm your host, Brad Cresswell, and today I'm joined in the studio by three historians from Ohio universities: Barry Jackisch, who is from University of Toledo; Doug Forsyth, who is from Bowling Green State University; and by phone we have Alice Conklin, who is at Ohio State University. And we also have Leah Whitaker from Toledo Opera, a familiar voice on this podcast, who has agreed to join us today. Welcome to all of you.
Hi, Brad.
Hello.
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 Let's start by each of you telling us a little bit about yourself and your study. What is your field of interest? And let's start with you, Alice.
Hey, well, I'm Alice Conklin. I am a member of the history department at the Ohio State University, and I'm primarily a historian of modern France, which means pretty much 19th and 20th century, though everybody in the modern period also knows a lot about what happened during the French Revolution.
Well, we're going to hear more about that momentarily, but I want to welcome Barry Jackisch, right?
Correct.
And what is your primary field of study?
So I am also a historian of modern Europe. I'm a bit further north of everyone in terms of my specialization. I'm a German historian in terms of training and background. Again, for the modern era, the 19th and 20th century. My more specific research interests focus on the history of German nationalism and racialist nationalism, anti-Semitism, and the age of world wars and the Holocaust.
Let's hear from Doug Forsyth, who is at Bowling Green State University.
Yeah, so I wrote a dissertation about Italy. It's about political economy and the kind of the unraveling of the of democracy in Italy during and after World War I. And I've done comparative history. German is actually my second language, and I'm married to a Spaniard and speak Spanish and English at home.
Whose favorite opera is?
Whose favorite opera is Tosca.
Yeah. And that's the reason that we're here, is basically we're using Tosca as kind of a touchstone to talk about what went on with society in the 19th century. A lot of stuff. I mean, in 100 years, a lot can happen. And we'll go outside that a little bit for you, Alice, because you mentioned the French Revolution and how it had a profound effect on what was to come. What is your take on that?
Well, the French Revolution of 1789 was the mother revolution to all subsequent ones in France, Europe, and arguably the world. It certainly was a massive upheaval. So the French Revolution abolished the very Catholic French monarchy and a society where everyone's place was fixed at birth. It tried to replace this old regime, as it was called, with a liberty-loving secular republic based on individual merit, individual rights, in which all white male men would have the vote. So it was exclusionary, but also a very exciting vision of liberty. And I would add that its goal was to build a new society on the basis of reason and equality rather than divine right, which was how the monarchy justified itself. It created a single set of laws, a single system of taxation, of weights and measures, in the place of the many different law codes and tariffs that had accrued under the monarchy in France. Very quickly, the revolution veers, despite its idealism, into civil war at home and war abroad, when the crowned heads of Europe, who were terrified of these revolutionaries, fought back. And this led to a dictatorship known as the Terror. A lot of people associate the French Revolution with this reign of terror when the king and queen were also beheaded. Finally, it took a man on horseback, a very young and ambitious Napoleon.
Yeah, the short king of history. That's what we call him.
But it took him to restore order at home and export some aspects of the revolution abroad by force. He's crowned himself emperor, and at that point had beaten the armies of France's enemies.
Leah, do you agree with everything Alice said?
Yeah, it sounded great to me. I mean, my kind of questions is sort of, I'm not well versed in this. It sounds like even though it might have started in France, that the whole revolutionary tendency was borderless, and that this, while maybe there were border disputes in those years that you mentioned along those decades, that these different revolutionary movements throughout all these countries were more about ideals, morals, values, economy than it was about drawing borders like we see maybe in disputes today.
Since we started out talking about the French Revolution and then moved into the 19th century and Napoleon, does anybody want to take the Napoleon ball and run with it? Tell us a little bit about his influence on the 19th century.
Well, I can certainly speak to part of this. One of the things there's a great deal. I mean, there are very few European and certainly even world figures that have been as heavily mythologized as Napoleon. You, for example, mentioned Ridley Scott's most recent film, which we don't have time to talk about.
It was terrible.
Thank you. Thanks for. I was trying to be more diplomatic.
Honestly, the soundtrack is beautiful, but
but people are. I think people are endlessly fascinated. I think, and some of you can correct me about this. I think people are still enamored with the idea of Napoleon as opposed to the reality, and this mythology that has emerged. I think in some way has replaced aspects of the reality of who Napoleon was as a person. But if we step back to the really big picture view to build on what we've just heard, one of the things to remember is that what Napoleon was doing was not simply trying to carry out these new revolutionary ideas and nationalist ideas, the idea of France as a nation rather than France as a sort of older imperial model. That idea was not just happening in France. Napoleon was, for lack of a better term, exporting this to other major parts of Europe. So when we talk about the opera today, when we talk about Tosca, and we're talking about French troops fighting Austrian troops in northern Italy. And so some of you who are familiar with this might say, why were French troops fighting Austrian troops in Italy, or what we think of today as Italy? And there's a very complicated historical background to that we don't have time to go into. But the point is, Napoleon was exporting a lot of these ideas to other European countries and other European empires, better said. So big states like Prussia, Austria, what would become the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and other areas in Europe whose leaders, kings and emperors, were deathly afraid of having happened to them what had happened to the Bourbon dynasty, the ruling dynasty of France, not necessarily under Napoleon, but under his predecessors. So there was a very real tension, if you want to think of it this way, between an emerging idea of nationalism, in other words, new nation states, and these older empires that tried to cobble people together under a sovereign or a king. And that is certainly one of the strains that runs throughout not only the opera that we're going to discuss today, but also the historical background of the 19th century.
When we talk about nationalism in our modern politics, what do we mean versus like what does the 19th century European feel?
I think this is a really important point for your listeners. Oftentimes today in current parlance, we hear the word nationalism, and sometimes people substitute for that the idea of patriotism. In other words, that you're proud of your country, or I believe in my nation. And the phrase that we're referring to here, especially coming out of the 19th century and the legacy of the French Revolution, is not so much the idea of patriotism or pride in one's country, but the idea that you can imagine the idea of a country as opposed to a lot of much smaller states. One of the things that both what we think of today as Italy and Germany, remember at the beginning of the 19th century, Italy and Germany did not exist as countries. They existed as a small collection of kingdoms and principalities and territories. At one time in Germany's history, for example, there were well over 300 of these in what is today modern Germany. So we think of the idea of a nation being a cohesive, coherent idea that we can identify, that has a flag, that has a national anthem, that has all these things. And in Europe of the 19th century, this was certainly not the case, especially early on, for the majority of the continent of Europe. Most of the continent of Europe was ruled by large empires with royal families whose interest it was to keep their territories under their control rather than allowing them to form into, let's say, solidified actual nations. And so, just to summarize, we are talking here actually about the process of actually creating nations instead of empires.
Unification.
There's a lot of carryover here to the arts and to culture and to composition, and especially classical music and opera. For example, in Germany, probably Germany's most famous composer, Richard Wagner, was very much focused on recovering what he regarded as kind of ancient Germanic myths or ideas that could then be tuned up and imported back into modern opera to reinforce the idea of what it meant to be German, as opposed to a smaller state in Germany like Prussia or Bavaria or somewhere else. So it's this idea of becoming an actual nation, not only physically with borders and a flag, but a number of scholars have talked about this for Germany and Italy and elsewhere. It's the idea of people imagining themselves to be German as opposed to a smaller state or Prussian. That's what we're talking about with the idea of nationalism here, as opposed to patriotism.
I wonder, Doug, what you think this experience of European nationalism looked like in Italy leading up to the premiere of Tosca?
You know, one thing that's interesting here is that this is set in Rome, and we've had this revolutionary government which has been running Rome that was imposed by the French, and then this coalition of anti-French forces has overrun Rome again, right? And they're the bad guys in the play, in the opera. The interesting thing here is that, and so it's the Italian collaborators with the French who are the good guys, right? In a way, this not surprisingly, it's based on a play that was written by a Frenchman named Sardou, and of course this played well in Paris. You know, this whole idea of the French being the good guys in Italy. Turning this into an opera in Italy is a little bit problematic. Now, and one thing that Puccini does. When he takes this play and massages it into a libretto for his opera, is he took a lot of that politics out. But it does create a certain tension, right? In Italy, that these supporters of the French are the good guys. So the one interesting thing about this about the opera is it's set in the year 1800. And there's the Battle of Marengo in the background, right? The French forces have been momentarily pushed back because of the debacle in Egypt of Napoleon, and you know these reactionary troops of the King of Naples have taken over Rome, right? And Scarpia, who's the bad guy, the heavy in the play, is working for the King of Naples. So then Napoleon wins the Battle of Marengo, and suddenly it looks like the revolution is going to be sustained in Italy, right? At least temporarily. So that's what's going on in 1800. And then the interesting thing is that the opera premieres in January 1900. So it's this curious symmetry, right? We've got this 100-year distance between the action that's taking place and the premiere of the opera. And at this time, Italy is kind of in a delicate political situation. It's had a kind of a rocky period since the 1890s. There was a banking crisis in 1893, and it involved actually Rome and conservative financial political interests in Rome, too. And then there's a military defeat in 1896 in Ethiopia at Ottawa. It's the biggest military defeat of Europeans in Africa in the 19th century. And then we have this wave of social unrest. First, there's a wave in the south of Italy and Sicily with the Fasci Siciliani in 1893-94, and martial law is declared, and it's put down with a good deal of bloodshed. And then in 1898, there's another wave of social unrest concentrated more in the north, and the Italian army under a man named Bava Beccaris opens fire in Milan and kills 80 people.
Jeez.
And afterwards, the king not only decorates Bava Becarius, but also appoints a general as the prime minister. His name is Luigi Pelò. And you've got conservatives saying that it's time for Italy to kind of roll back constitutionalism, well, not constitutional, but roll back democracy and roll back the responsibility of the government to parliament and go back to a situation where the king can appoint his own ministers, even without a support in Parliament. So it's an ambiguous situation, and this is when the opera premieres. And of course, anyone looking at it is going to think, oh, the good guys are the revolutionaries, right, who are the heirs to the tradition of the French Revolution, and the bad guys are these reactionaries, right? I would think, and so certainly the opera has some political resonance at the time when it premieres. One thing that's interesting is that Luigi Pelò, this general turned prime minister who's running Italy as a quasi-dictatorship, was actually at the premiere along with the Queen. But so they didn't see it, apparently, at least in advance, they didn't see it as being a direct attack on politics.
So it sounds like Italy's nationalism was never separated from its military might. You're describing these tense politics, and then the national government has generals, and I mean, it sounds really fascist.
It's a moment in which Italy could have gone one way or the other.
Yeah.
There are people who are saying, let's go back. And there are other people who are saying, let's go forward. And what happens after the opera premieres is Italy goes forward. Okay. There are elections just a few months after the premiere of the opera, and the left gains ground. The king actually appoints somebody who's not nearly as reactionary as Pelò to replace him. Then the king gets assassinated by an anarchist.
Wow.
And a younger king comes into power, and within a year you've got the farthest left government that Italy has ever had, which is kind of committed to continuing the experiment with democracy by 1901.
Can I just say one last thing about nationalism? And it may segue into sort of romanticism too, but France and England are the sort of model nation states, because at this time they are essentially unified. Not all French speak French yet, but the monarchy easily sort of becomes a republic within mostly the same borders. And by attacking the German-speaking lands and the Italian-speaking lands, they also offered a model. You know, this is what we want to be, you know, a single people united into a nation. And the word nation is very much part of the French Revolution. But so the French, and I'm not going to talk much about the English, but the French really are both an outlier and extraordinarily sort of influential model for other European countries and the Germans, and you can speak more to this, Doug and Barry, and the Italians, you know, initially hoped that nation building and democracy or liberal institutions can come into being together.
Well, let's dig into that idea of romanticism versus rationalism. That's one of the things that you mentioned, Alice. Mm-hmm. When I think of romanticism in the 19th century, I think it's tied somewhat to what you were talking about. Did that have an influence on the politics?
It absolutely did. And I think Doug and I both spoke about this. Doug, I don't know if you want to speak about the Italian context. I mean, certainly in the case of Germany, you have this conflict. I mean, after the Napoleonic era is over in 1815, if you want to put it this way, there are massive reverberations throughout many of the German lands. And you have a lot of the old order royal families and rulers that want their stuff back. They don't like what all of these wars did. They don't like what the Napoleonic influence did. And so there are quite a few of them, Clemens von Metternich and others in Central Europe, who want to basically put things back to the way they were. And at the same time, because of Napoleon's influence throughout much of Europe, there is now a whole generation of people who say, we don't want to be part of an empire necessarily in small states. we think we would be more effective together as a nation. And that nationalism for a period in the 19th century begins to merge with this idea of romanticism, that this is not just a sterile intellectual exercise to talk about borders and ideas, but that it actually draws on emotions, that it means something passionately to be part of a nation. And that merger between this emerging nationalism and romanticism, which is a very broad phrase, certainly exists in the German context. If we look in painting, for example, we can see this. There are many good examples of this sort of Germanic romanticism, for sure. Doug, what about Italy?
I think I'd like to comment about the opera itself. In the opera, of course, the original play, which is by this Frenchman named Sardou, you have rationalism. You have this the one key figure is Angelotti. He's this escapee from Neapolitan prison, who had been a figure in the Roman Republic, right? And he's a doctor, and embodies the kind of the rationalism of the Republican project, right? And then we have Tosca, and Tosca is all about love and religion and passion, really. And then sort of in the middle we have Cavaradossi, right? Her lover, who's also kind of, when he decides that he's going to hide Angelotti, the escaped political prisoner, he says it's because of friendship, really, more than politics. Now he's not even thinking about it in political terms. And so he's kind of in between, but also seems to be putting friendship and loyalty above rationality or above political calculations.
Let's hear some of the music from Tosca that I think shows how Cavaradossi's romantic ideals for Tosca are in conflict with the religious and other forces in Rome, which is represented by the sacristan in this opening aria. We'll hear this towards the end of the music clip. This is Cavaradossi's first aria, in which he lays out his character and his ideals, or recondita armonia, or hidden harmony. It's a 1967 recording, tenor Franco Corelli and bass Alfredo Mariotti as the sacristan, and you can hear him muttering, the sacristan that is, about Cavaradossi's portrait, saying various women in rivalry with the Madonna smell of the devil. Then he goes on to characterize Cavaradossi as an agnostic dog and an enemy of the holy government. A little bit of foreshadowing there. How did religion fare in the 19th century versus secularism?
Yeah, so religion is very important in the opera, of course. This is taking place in Rome, and the bad guys are kind of on the side of the Catholic religion, right? They're organizing this Te Deum, right, which they're going to sing
Scarpia singing it
in affirmation of what they think is the Austrian victory at the Battle of Marengo, but then it turns out, right, and a few hours later they get this second information that Napoleon actually won.
They jump the gun.
But in any case, so religion is clearly there, and Puccini had his bone to pick with the Catholic Church. He was living in sin with a woman who was married to somebody else named Elvira. And some elements of his wife's character probably find their way into his depiction of Tosca in the opera, too. So there is a clear anti-clerical kind of dimension to this, both in the French play and in the Italian opera.
I would like to interject with some, because I actually did go to seminary, Brad.
Oh, wow.
And I know. And I vaguely remember, now everybody can fact check me later, but part of
we don't do fact checking for
great.
this
then
podcast.
I'm
Sorry.
very comfortable.
You can say anything you want.
Seminary professors are blushing. Anyway, but part of the problem, the relationship between the Pope and the feudal lords and the kings, is that there is this real power grab with lands and taxation and everything that the Catholic Church, the Pope, Rome, wanted all of this to come back to the Catholic Church, and a lot of these smaller kings and lords were fighting the Catholic Church and fighting Rome and trying to consolidate power in nation states in their own territories. So I think that, it seems to me the Catholic Church in art is always portrayed as the bad guy. It seems to be a common thread throughout history, but part of it is that the Catholic Church has always had its hands in the monarchy. It's had its hands in the coffers of the people. And at times throughout history, there is reformation and change and pushback from the monopolistic control of Rome.
The anti-clericalism is not particularly controversial in Italy in 1900. Keep in mind that this Italian kingdom has been excommunicated by the Pope. And the Pope has also instructed true Christians to have nothing to do with the state or with elections or political parties or any of that. And so even Luigi Pello wouldn't have been offended, right, by the anti-clericalism in the opera when he went to the premiere in Rome in January 1900.
Well, and it goes back to that conversation of, rationalism and the common man always has that pull between, the mythology of their faith, which was generally the Catholic Church, and the superstitions and the mythology and the different, sacramental practice that wasn't necessarily available to them in their common language. And then what their state was demanding of them. So it's like no wonder there was a revolution. They, all the people were getting it from every side here.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about the opera is that there's a bit of a contrast in it between the personal religious faith of Tosca, which is depicted favorably, I think, and the institutional Roman Church, right, which looks awful. They're organizing this Te Deum. To celebrate the Austrian victory and so forth.
It's helpful to think about Europeans in this period as being anti-clerical, because secularism, that's not exactly the same thing. Obviously, they're related, but it's the tremendous power, as you pointed out, Leah, of the Catholic Church, which is already contested in the French Revolution. The revolutionaries attack the church. They basically expropriate it because they need money, and they just nationalize or sell off, I should say, all the church land holdings. And the church is one of, if not the biggest landholder in France before the French Revolution. So that it's and France is a majority Catholic country, and this certainly in the 18th century, becoming less faithful, but you can be viciously anti-clerical, anti-Catholic. That's the background in France.
Just very quickly to follow up on this idea of religion and nationalism, one of the things is that these two concepts, one of the things that many Americans often think of, we like to talk about this idea, and we're not going to go into that today, the idea of freedom of religion, right? This is the notion that you can be a good American no matter what your religious preferences or whether you have none at all or whatever. For much of the 19th century, certainly desacralization and moving away from the formal structures of the church was part of that process, to be sure. But we need to remember, in the European context in the 19th and even into the 20th century, very often as these nation states formed, being part of the nation also in some cases could mean at least formally being part of a particular Christian religious faith. So this is, again, in the case of Germany, very much true. If you lived in the south of Germany, very likely to be, for example, a Bavarian, in many cases meant that you were Catholic. If you were in the north, in Prussia, for example, you would be Protestant, Lutheran, or Calvinist extraction, whatever it would be. So the freedom of religion doesn't necessarily apply here in the same way that it does in the United States, in that often being a citizen, in the case of the state of Prussia, for example, you couldn't be a military officer unless you were a particular religion. One example of this is this place of Jews in Germany in the 19th century. Jews were excluded, for the most part, from a wide variety of different professions. They weren't even citizens, actually, until later in the 19th century. So the idea of religion is not just a side piece, as my colleagues and Leah Views mentioned. It's very much central to the identity of these emerging nations and what it means to be a nation.
Well, we don't have time to dig really deep into the 19th century as a whole, but I wonder if there's anything left unsaid that you want to talk about.
The Sardou play is finished in 1887, right? And this is really the height of kind of the influence of General Boulanger, right? Who represents the most significant threat to the Third Republic, really, at the end of the 19th century. And how would that have been read by audiences in France for the play?
Well, I think the Boulanger crisis, as it was called, was also, it seemed like a very popular army general was going to whip up popular support and overturn the democratic regime that was the Third Republic. It turned out to be a kind of tempest in a teapot when Boulanger was more or less stripped of office. The reminder that all through the 19th century there was always a struggle between people who, the Republicans or the revolutionaries who wanted to defend constitutional and individual rights, and the more conservative forces who really did want to bring back authoritarian regimes. So in 1900, you could argue France is once again being roiled by political conflict. People were going around armed and gangs and shooting their perceived enemies. So yes, it would have been possibly, read against that backdrop. But the opera is not overtly political, and I think most of the people, apparently the reception, made no comment about any kind of political messaging in it. So we are really, with the advantage of hindsight, we can then say, yes, the threat of kind of militant nationalism, which could threaten constitutionalism, was always there, and it was getting actually, more dangerous by the end of the 19th century. That's why we get to World War I, this sort of cataclysm of this explosion of competing nationalisms, among other things.
I would say about the politics of the opera, it's very basic. Puccini has reduced the political context quite a bit from the play, but it's the forces of reaction against the forces of progress. Anybody can kind of get that from the libretto, right, from watching the opera. And that was certainly the way the play would have been read in 1900, it seems to me, in Italy, where you again have tensions in society, and successive productions of Tosca are always thinking about how it fits into contemporary politics. There was a version of it in 1956 where reference was made to Hungary, for instance, right? The communist, the rebellion against communist rule in Hungary. There's been a South African production that invoked the situation in South Africa under apartheid. People always look around and try to figure out what the forces of progress and forces of reaction are in their own time, and interpret the opera accordingly.
Well, I think that for modern audiences, going to see the opera, it's an opera. It's a great opera, but it's very realistic. I think it's important for them to know the influences that went into it, and these events that we've been talking about of the 19th century all in some way kind of affected Puccini for better, for worse, to certain degrees.
Certainly the romanticism. I mean, that Italian verismo and the huge displays of emotion, having an opera diva as the main character really does speak to that, the power of that movement at the time he was writing.
Yeah, Viva la Diva.
Viva la Diva, yeah. That's right.
Well, I think one reason my wife likes the opera is because she thinks it has a feminist message.
Oh, yeah. It certainly does.
That's material for another entire discussion right there. You've been listening to Opera Out of the Box, a co-production of WGTE Public Media and Toledo Opera, with additional support from Ohio Humanities. You can find previous episodes online at our website, wgte.org, and of course you can dive into all things Toledo Opera at their website, toledoopera.org. I want to thank my guests today, Professors Barry Jackisch, Doug Forsyth, Alice Conklin, also Toledo Opera's own Leah Whitaker. I'm your host, Brad Cresswell. Thanks for joining us for Opera Out of the Box.